Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past comes alive. Today, we journey into one of the most defining chapters of American history, the Civil War, a nation divided. This was not just a clash of armies, but a struggle over freedom, democracy, and the soul of a nation. From the first shots at Fort Sumter to the bloody fields of Gettysburg and Antietam, from Lincoln's bold Emancipation Proclamation to Sherman's March of Destruction, this war reshaped America forever. It tested whether a republic born in liberty could survive division, and whether millions enslaved would finally claim freedom. In this series, we'll uncover soldier diaries, maps of epic battles, the rise of Abraham Lincoln, the courage of African American troops, the resilience of women, and the scars left on families and communities. By the end, you will see how the Civil War was not only about North versus South, but about the very meaning of freedom, equality, and union. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear is more than history. It's the story of how a nation nearly tore itself apart, and how it struggled to become whole again. The American Civil War did not erupt suddenly in 1861. Rather, it was the result of decades of tension between two very different regions of the same young republic. From the very founding of the United States, slavery stood as a contradiction to the ideals of liberty and equality declared in 1776. The South developed into an agricultural powerhouse, heavily reliant on enslaved African labor to cultivate cotton, tobacco, and rice. By contrast, the North moved rapidly toward industrialization, with factories, railroads, and immigrant labor shaping its economy. These different paths produced not only economic distinctions, but also deep cultural divides. To many in the North, slavery was a moral stain and an obstacle to progress, while to many white Southerners it was seen as the very foundation of their prosperity and way of life. The expansion of the United States westward after the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable question: would slavery extend into these new territories? Each time new land was opened, whether Missouri in 1820 or Kansas in the 1850s, the debate reignited. Northerners feared the spread of what they called the slave power, while Southerners believed any restriction on slavery threatened their survival. By the 1850s, the United States was no longer simply divided by geography, but by ideology, one half imagining a future of free labor and innovation, the other defending a system rooted in human bondage. This irreconcilable conflict was the seedbed of war. Throughout the early 19th century, American politicians attempted to manage the tension between North and South through compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 created a delicate balance, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while drawing an imaginary line across the Louisiana Territory to determine where slavery could expand. For a time, this arrangement quieted disputes, but as new states entered the Union, the fragile equilibrium faltered. The Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state but strengthened the fugitive slave law, only deepened bitterness. Many Northerners were outraged at being legally compelled to aid in the capture of escaped slaves, while Southerners demanded strict enforcement as a test of loyalty to the Union. By the mid-1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered earlier agreements by allowing settlers in those territories to decide the fate of slavery through popular sovereignty. The result was a bloody conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed violently. The scenes of homes burned and families murdered shocked Americans, making clear that words and votes might no longer be enough to contain the growing divide. At the same time, new political parties emerged. The Republican Party founded in 1854, dedicated itself to stopping the expansion of slavery. For Southerners, the rise of this party signaled that their interests were under direct attack. By the time of the 1860 election, the nation was standing at a precipice, and no compromise seemed possible. The presidential election of 1860 became the ultimate test of America's unity. For candidates represented the fractured political landscape. Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party, who opposed the spread of slavery. Stephen A. Douglas, championing popular sovereignty. John C. Breckinridge, defending slavery's expansion. And John Bell, seeking compromise above all else. Lincoln's victory, achieved without carrying a single Southern state, convinced many Southerners that their voice in national affairs was permanently silenced. To them, the Union had become a hostile force. Within weeks of Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states declared themselves a new nation, the Confederate States of America, dedicated to preserving slavery and their independence. Lincoln, preparing to take office, faced the gravest crisis any American president had yet encountered. Could a nation founded on liberty endure half slave and half free? The symbolic center of this struggle would soon be Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where federal troops held out against secessionist forces. As the first shots rang out in April 1861, the time for compromise ended. The United States was plunged in a civil war, a conflict that would claim more lives than all of America's previous wars combined. The war's opening salvo came in April 1861, when Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. For 34 hours, artillery rained down upon the isolated garrison until Union Major Robert Anderson surrendered. Though no one died in the bombardment, its symbolic weight was enormous. The illusion of peace collapsed. President Abraham Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, and men from farms, villages, and cities rushed to enlist. Crowds in the North paraded through the streets with flags and bands, convinced the war would be short, perhaps lasting only 90 days. Yet in the South, equally enthusiastic volunteers gathered, believing they were defending their homes and liberty against Northern aggression. The divide was no longer political. It was now military, and the fate of a nation would be decided by arms. The first real test came in July 1861, near a small Virginia stream called Bull Run, or Manassas, as Southerners named it. Union General Irvin McDowell marched his unseasoned troops toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, hoping to end the rebellion quickly. On July 21st, the two armies collided in a chaotic struggle. At first, Union forces gained ground, but Confederate reinforcements under General Thomas J. Jackson held firm. Jackson's resolute stand earned him the nickname Stonewall, and by late afternoon the Union lines collapsed into a frantic retreat toward Washington. Civilians who had come out with picnic baskets to watch the spectacle fled in terror as the reality of modern war revealed itself. The first battle of Bull Run shattered illusions on both sides. The North realized the war would not be quick or easy, while the South gained confidence that independence might truly be within reach. The young men who marched so confidently into war soon learned that battles were only a fraction of a soldier's life. For every hour of combat, there were weeks of drill, camp duty, and endless marching through mud and dust. Union and Confederate diaries from 1861 to 62 describe long days of boredom punctuated by sudden moments of terror. Soldiers wrote of sleeping on the ground with little shelter, eating hardtack biscuits so tough they could break teeth, and drinking coffee boiled in tin cups over smoky fires. Disease was often a greater enemy than bullets. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia spread rapidly through camps, claiming more lives than combat in those early years. Letters home reveal the emotional strain as well. Young men missed their families, worried about farms left untended, and wrestled with fear of death. Yet there was also a sense of adventure and camaraderie. Men formed close bonds with their regimental messmates, sharing food, jokes, and songs to pass the time. Diaries often mention the singing of Dixie in southern camps or John Brown's Body in northern ones, songs that captured each side's spirit. Soldiers marched under flags sewn by their mothers and sweethearts, convinced they were fighting for sacred causes, whether the preservation of the Union or the defense of Southern independence. The human side of war, preserved in these personal writings, reminds us that beneath the sweeping strategies were individuals whose hopes and fears gave the conflict its beating heart. By 1862, the war escalated in both scale and bloodshed. Union General George B. McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac, launched a campaign to capture Richmond, but his caution allowed Confederate General Robert E. Lee to seize the initiative. In September 1862, Lee boldly invaded the North, marching into Maryland. His goal was to win a decisive victory on Union soil, encourage European recognition of the Confederacy, and weaken Northern morale. The two armies met near the town of Sharpsburg, along Antietam Creek. On September 17, 1862, dawn revealed one of the most horrific spectacles in American history. For 12 hours, wave after wave of Union and Confederate attacks clashed across the cornfields, the sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane, and a narrow stone bridge spanning Antietam Creek. Soldiers' diaries describe the air thick with smoke, the ground slippery with blood, and comrades falling in heaps. A private in the 20th New York wrote that the cornfield was cut down as if by a scythe. By the day's end, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, the bloodiest single day in American history. Though tactically a draw, Lee's retreat back into Virginia gave Lincoln the claim of Union victory he needed. Days later, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war from a struggle merely to preserve the Union into a moral crusade to end slavery. Antietam thus marked a turning point. The conflict was now not only about saving a nation, but also about redefining the meaning of freedom itself. After the bloody stalemate at Antietam in September 1862, Abraham Lincoln saw a chance to reshape the very meaning of the conflict. Until then, his central aim had been saving the Union. Personally, Lincoln detested slavery, yet he moved cautiously, fearing that border states like Kentucky and Missouri might join the Confederacy if he acted too boldly. But Antietam gave him the leverage he needed. On September 22, 1862, he issued a preliminary decree. Unless the rebellious states returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, their slaves would be declared forever free. None of the Confederate states complied. When the deadline arrived, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This act did not instantly free all 4 million enslaved people. Its authority applied only to areas still in rebellion, beyond Union control. Yet its symbolic power was immense. From that moment, the Union Army marched not only to preserve the nation, but also to destroy slavery. Enslaved people across the South heard whispers of Lincoln's words and fled plantations to seek Union lines, where many enlisted in newly formed black regiments. Their courage would soon prove decisive. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North hailed Lincoln's bold step, while Confederate leaders denounced it as an incitement to slave rebellion. Internationally, the proclamation had a crucial effect. Britain and France, both with strong anti-slavery movements, hesitated to recognize a Confederacy fighting openly for bondage. Thus, the Emancipation Proclamation was not just a wartime measure. It was a moral and diplomatic turning point that redefined the American experiment. In the summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched another daring invasion of the North. His army, flushed with victory after Chancellorsville, marched into Pennsylvania, hoping to strike a decisive blow that might force Northern leaders to negotiate peace. The Union Army of the Potomac, under newly appointed General George Jumeed, moved to intercept. The two forces collided at the small town of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. For 3 days, thunderous combat engulfed the rolling hills and ridges. On the first day, Confederate troops pushed Union defenders back through the town, but the Union regrouped on strong high ground at Cemetery Hill. On July 2nd, desperate attacks and counterattacks raged across places that would become legendary. Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den diaries tell of hand-to-hand struggles in tangled woods, of soldiers firing until their muskets grew too hot to hold. On July 3rd came Lee's bold gamble, Pickett's charge. Nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers advanced in a mile-long line across open fields toward the Union Center. Union artillery and musket fire tore gaps in their ranks, and the charge collapsed in bloody defeat. By the end, Gettysburg had claimed around 51,000 casualties. The Confederacy's dream of victory on Northern soil was shattered. Gettysburg became known as the high-water mark of the Confederacy. Never again would Lee threaten the Union heartland so directly. While armies clashed in the fields, Lincoln bore the immense weight of leadership. He faced critics in Congress, generals who doubted him, and public opinion that wavered with each battlefield report. Yet Lincoln's strength lay in his moral clarity and his gift for words. In November 1863, he traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. His Gettysburg Address, only 272 words long, reframed the war in stark terms. It was a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. With simple but profound language, Lincoln gave purpose to sacrifice, ensuring that the dead had not fallen in vain. Internationally, the war drew close attention. Britain's textile mills suffered from shortages of Southern cotton. Yet public opinion increasingly favored the Union after emancipation. Confederate hopes for foreign recognition faded as European leaders hesitated to support a government fighting for slavery. Meanwhile, the Union blockades strangled Southern trade, cutting off vital supplies. Lincoln's administration carefully balanced military necessity with political strategy, knowing the world was watching. The Civil War, once seen as an internal American quarrel, had become a global moral drama. In this crucible, Lincoln's steady hand kept the Union focused not merely on reunion, but on a rebirth of freedom. While the Eastern campaigns around Washington and Richmond captured most headlines, the Civil War's Western theater was equally decisive. Here, battles unfolded across vast landscapes: Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and along the great artery of the Mississippi River. Control of this river meant control of the Confederacy's lifeline. The Mississippi carried food, cotton, and supplies from the Deep South to markets and ports. If the Union could dominate the river, the Confederacy would be cut in two, isolating Texas, Arkansas, and western Louisiana from the rest. Abraham Lincoln understood this well, declaring that the Mississippi is the backbone of the rebellion. The early Union strategy, known as the Anaconda Plan, envisioned a blockade of southern ports combined with seizing the Mississippi to squeeze the Confederacy. In 1862, Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, led by a rising commander named Ulysses S. Grant, opened the door into the South. Grant's aggressive style, demanding unconditional surrender, marked him as a leader willing to fight until total victory. Meanwhile, Union naval forces under Admiral David Farragut pushed northward, capturing New Orleans in April 1862. The fall of this vital port shocked the Confederacy and gave the Union a powerful foothold. Yet the river was long, and its fortress at Vicksburg still stood as the Confederacy's Gibraltar. The Western campaigns were not sideshows. They were battles to choke the South's very heart. By 1863, all eyes turned to Vicksburg, Mississippi, perched high on bluffs overlooking a bend in the river. As long as this city held, Confederate control of the Mississippi survived. Ulysses S. Grant launched a daring campaign to encircle and besiege the fortress city. His soldiers cut supply lines, destroyed railroads, and marched through swamps to position themselves around Vicksburg. Beginning in May 1863, Grant tightened the noose. Union artillery pounded the city daily, while sharpshooters made movement dangerous. Inside Vicksburg, citizens and soldiers alike dug caves into the hillsides to escape bombardment. Diaries from residents describe mothers sheltering children in underground hovels, surviving on mule meat and peas. Hunger gnawed at the population as weeks dragged on. For Confederate General John C. Pemberton, the situation grew hopeless. His men were exhausted, short of food and ammunition, and outnumbered. On July 4th, 1863, ironically the nation's Independence Day, Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg to Grant. The timing was striking. Just one day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, the Union scored another major triumph. The Mississippi River was now entirely in Union hands, and the Confederacy was permanently split. Grant's victory at Vicksburg elevated him to national fame, and Lincoln praised him as a general who truly understood how to fight. For Southerners, the fall of Vicksburg was devastating, a blow to both morale and logistics. The West was no longer secure, and the Confederacy's dream of expansion into the Trans-Mississippi West was effectively crushed. Even before Vicksburg, the Western theater had seen brutal clashes that tested soldiers' endurance. In April 1862, the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee shocked the nation. Grant's army, surprised by a Confederate dawn attack, fought desperately amid wooded fields and along a sunken road later called the Hornet's Nest. By the end, over 23,000 men were killed or wounded. Shiloh proved the war would be long and bloody, dashing hopes of quick victory. Critics accused Grant of carelessness, yet Lincoln defended him with the famous line, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Later, Union victories at Chattanooga in late 1863 opened the gateway to the Deep South. Grant's forces, reinforced by General William Tecumseh Sherman, stormed Missionary Ridge in a dramatic assault. The sight of blue-coated soldiers scrambling up steep slopes under fire became legendary. These victories gave the Union control of vital railroads and paved the way for Sherman's march into Georgia. They also cemented Grant's reputation as the Union's most capable commander. His relentlessness, willingness to absorb casualties, and ability to coordinate large armies would soon earn him promotion to General-in-Chief of all Union forces. In the West, the Union had achieved dominance. Combined with Gettysburg in the East, 1863 marked the war's turning tide. The Confederacy was on the defensive, battered yet still unbroken. But the Union now had momentum, leaders, and control of crucial territory. By 1864, the Union sought not only to win battles, but to break the Confederacy's capacity to resist. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a close ally of Ulysses S. Grant, was entrusted with the Army of the West. His target, Atlanta, Georgia, a vital rail hub and industrial center. Taking Atlanta would cripple Confederate supply lines and strike at Southern morale. Sherman advanced from Chattanooga in May 1864, facing Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. What followed was a campaign of maneuver and attrition. Sherman avoided costly frontal assaults, instead using flanking movements to force Johnston back, battle after battle, through rugged terrain. Confederate soldiers fought fiercely at Resaca, Kennesaw Mountain, and other positions, but the relentless Union advance proved unstoppable. Civilians in Georgia watched as armies clashed across their fields, and the once prosperous countryside burned. In July, Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with the fiery John Bell Hood, who launched aggressive attacks but bled his army white. By September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta fell into Sherman's hands. Its capture electrified the North. Lincoln, facing re-election, had feared defeat as war weariness grew, but news of Atlanta revived Union spirits and ensured his victory in November. For the South, the loss of Atlanta was catastrophic. Factories destroyed, railroads severed, and public confidence shaken. The Confederacy now faced not just military defeat, but economic strangulation. Sherman's reputation as a ruthless but effective commander was sealed. With Atlanta secured, Sherman embarked on one of the most infamous campaigns in American history, the March to the Sea. From November to December 1864, his army of 60,000 men cut a swath through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah. Sherman abandoned traditional supply lines, instead living off the land. His troops destroyed railroads, burned barns, seized livestock, and confiscated food. This strategy, known as Hard War, aimed not only to cripple Confederate logistics, but also to break the will of the Southern population. Sherman believed the quickest way to end the war was to make its costs unbearable. Diaries from Georgia civilians described terror as blue-coated soldiers swept through towns and farms. Barns burned, fences toppled, and smoke darkened the sky. Yet Sherman's men also wrote of the strange freedom of marching unencumbered, unchallenged by major Confederate forces. Unlike earlier campaigns, the march was not focused on set-piece battles, but on destruction as a weapon. By mid-December, Sherman reached Savannah, which surrendered without resistance. He telegraphed Lincoln, offering the city as a Christmas gift. The march to the sea demonstrated a grim reality. The Civil War had become total war, targeting not just armies, but the society that sustained them. It sent shockwaves across the South, proving that the Union could move at will deep within Confederate territory. After Savannah, Sherman turned northward into the Carolinas in early 1865, determined to crush what remained of Confederate resistance. South Carolina, the state that had led secession, received particularly harsh treatment. Union soldiers burned Columbia, its capital, leaving smoldering ruins. Though controversy remains over who started the fires, the destruction symbolized the punishment of the state that had ignited the rebellion. Sherman's army carved through the countryside, scattering Confederate defenders and leaving devastation in its wake. For civilians, the war was no longer a distant thunder, but an unavoidable catastrophe. Meanwhile, Confederate armies were stretched to the breaking point. General Hood's forces, after reckless assaults in Tennessee, were shattered at the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. Lee's army in Virginia was besieged at Petersburg, desperately holding lines against Grant's relentless pressure. In the Carolinas, Sherman's advance left Southerners with no illusion of victory. The Confederacy was collapsing from within. Railroads torn up, crops destroyed, slaves fleeing to Union lines, and morale sinking. Sherman's campaigns exemplified the grim final stage of the war, where destruction was wielded as a tool to end the conflict more swiftly. By spring 1865, Union armies were converging from all directions, and the Confederacy stood at the edge of ruin. The once proud rebellion was in its death throes, and the question was no longer if the Union would prevail, but how soon. By early 1864, Abraham Lincoln had elevated Ulysses S. Grant to the position of General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant brought with him the lessons of the Western theater: unrelenting pressure, coordinated movements, and refusal to retreat after setbacks. Unlike earlier Union commanders who hesitated or withdrew after defeats, Grant resolved to wage a war of attrition. His goal was not necessarily to capture Richmond quickly, but to destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most formidable force. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he declared. Thus began the Overland Campaign in May 1864, a brutal series of battles across Virginia's forests and fields. At the Battle of the Wilderness, Union and Confederate forces clashed in dense woods where gunfire set the underbrush aflame, trapping wounded men in fiery death. Despite heavy losses, nearly 17,000 Union casualties, Grant did not retreat. Instead, he pressed forward, forcing Lee into another confrontation at Spotsylvania Court House. There, the infamous Bloody Angle witnessed nearly 20 hours of continuous hand-to-hand fighting in the rain as men stabbed and fired at point-blank range across muddy trenches. The carnage was staggering, but Grant kept moving south, always angling toward Richmond. Unlike McClellan or Hooker before him, Grant refused to disengage. For the Confederacy, this new kind of relentless warfare was ominous. The Union had both manpower and industry to sustain such pressure, while the South bled with no hope of replenishment. The Overland Campaign reached another crescendo at Cold Harbor in June 1864. Grant, attempting to break Lee's entrenched lines, ordered a massive frontal assault. The result was disastrous. Union soldiers, advancing across open ground, were cut down in swathes by Confederate fire. Within minutes, thousands lay dead or wounded. Survivors scratched epitaphs on slips of paper pinned to their backs, grimly expecting death. In less than an hour, the Union lost nearly 7,000 men. Grant would later admit Cold Harbor was the only attack he regretted. Yet even this slaughter did not deter him. Instead of retreating northward as earlier generals had done, Grant pivoted south, crossing the James River and striking toward Petersburg, a rail hub vital to supplying Richmond. Here began a siege that would last nearly 10 months. Petersburg became a grim foreshadowing of modern trench warfare, with both sides digging elaborate networks of fortifications. Soldiers endured constant sniper fire, artillery barges, and disease in the muddy ditches. One of the most dramatic episodes came in July 1864, when Union troops tunneled beneath Confederate lines and detonated a massive mine, creating a crater 170 feet long. But poor coordination turned the opportunity into disaster, as Union troops became trapped in the crater and slaughtered. Despite setbacks, Grant maintained pressure, knowing Lee's army could not endure indefinitely. The siege of Petersburg tested both armies' endurance through the fall and winter of 1864-65. For Confederate soldiers, supplies dwindled to near starvation levels. Diaries speak of meals of cornbread mixed with acorns, ragged uniforms, and bare feet in freezing weather. Desertion rates climbed as men slipped away to check on families left destitute by Union raids. In contrast, Union forces, though suffering hardships of their own, could rely on steady streams of food, weapons, and reinforcements. The imbalance was stark. The Confederacy was running out of time and blood. Meanwhile, Lincoln faced political challenges at home. War weariness peaked in the North during the summer of 1864, with critics calling Grant a butcher for the immense casualties of the Overland Campaign. But the fall of Atlanta in September and the tightening noose around Petersburg helped secure Lincoln's re-election in November. His victory guaranteed that the war would be fought to its conclusion with no compromise peace. Grant, supported by Sherman advancing from the South, orchestrated a strategy of simultaneous offensives that left the Confederacy with no respite. By early 1865, cracks in Lee's defenses widened. Union forces extended their lines, stretching Confederate manpower too thin. Skirmishes turned into breakthroughs, and morale in Richmond faltered. Newspapers warned of imminent collapse, while civilians hoarded dwindling supplies. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia was now a shadow of itself, fighting valiantly but hopelessly. The grinding months at Petersburg symbolized the larger reality. The Confederacy was being slowly strangled. Soon, Lee would be forced to abandon both Petersburg and Richmond, setting the stage for the war's final act at Appomattox. The summer of 1864 found the Union at a breaking point. After 3 years of bloody conflict, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and little sign of immediate victory, many Northerners were weary of war. Newspapers reported staggering casualty lists, and critics labeled Grant a butcher for his relentless campaigns in Virginia. In this climate of exhaustion, Abraham Lincoln faced re-election. At first, his chances looked bleak. Even he privately admitted he might not win, writing a note to his cabinet acknowledging that the next president would inherit the task of saving the Union. His Democratic opponent, former Union General George B. McClellan, ran on a platform calling for negotiation with the Confederacy, though he himself remained personally committed to Union. Many feared that a McClellan victory would lead to a compromise peace that left slavery intact and the Confederacy alive. But events shifted dramatically in Lincoln's favor. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September electrified Northern morale. Suddenly, Union progress was undeniable. Lincoln's message that the war must be fought until victory and emancipation were secured resonated with voters. In November, Lincoln won re-election by a wide margin, carrying 22 of 25 loyal states. His triumph gave him the mandate to finish the war on his terms. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, Lincoln struck a somber but profoundly moral tone, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. These words revealed his vision not only for military victory, but for national reconciliation, even as the final battles loomed. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy staggered under the crushing weight of Union offensives. Grant's forces tightened their grip on Petersburg, while Sherman's army rampaged northward through the Carolinas. Supplies dwindled, railroads were wrecked, and morale plummeted. Richmond, the Confederate capital, became a city under siege. Residents endured food shortages so severe that bread riots erupted, with women storming shops in desperation. Confederate leaders debated desperate measures, but Robert E. Lee warned that without abandoning Richmond, his army would be trapped. On April 2nd, 1865, after months of grinding combat, Union forces finally broke through Petersburg's defenses. Lee informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis that Richmond could no longer be held. Davis and his government fled by train, abandoning the city. As Confederate troops retreated, fires broke out, some deliberately set to destroy supplies, others spreading uncontrollably. By the time Union soldiers entered on April 3rd, Richmond was engulfed in flames. Black residents celebrated freedom in the streets, welcoming Union troops as liberators. The fall of Richmond carried immense symbolic weight. The Confederacy's heart had been pierced, its capital in Union hands. For Northerners, the moment marked vindication after years of sacrifice. For Southerners, it was a bitter sign that the end had come. Lee's army, once the pride of the South, now struggled westward, desperately seeking supplies and reinforcements. Exhausted soldiers, many barefoot, trudged through mud and rain with little food. Union cavalry and infantry pursued relentlessly, cutting off escape routes. Skirmishes erupted at Amelia Court House, Sailor's Creek, and other crossroads, each further eroding Confederate strength. Thousands surrendered or deserted along the way. Lee knew his army was cornered, but his sense of duty compelled him to continue as long as hope remained. For ordinary Confederates, the collapse was devastating. Diaries describe the despair of civilians watching their men return in rags, or not return at all. Slaves, hearing rumors of emancipation confirmed by Union advances, fled plantations in ever greater numbers. The Confederate government, scattered and powerless, could no longer command loyalty or resources. The rebellion was disintegrating from within even before the final surrender. By early April, Lee realized that further resistance would mean only needless slaughter. His plan to link with Confederate forces in North Carolina proved impossible. Cut off, starving, and surrounded, he prepared to meet Grant at a small Virginia town called Appomattox Court House. There, the Civil War central drama would find its quiet but momentous conclusion. On April 9th, 1865, the drama of 4 years of Civil War reached its climax at a quiet Virginia village called Appomattox Court House. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once the Confederacy's most formidable force, was now exhausted and surrounded. His soldiers, many shoeless and starving, had fought bravely to the end but could march no further. Union troops under Ulysses South Grant blocked every road of escape. Lee faced the hardest decision of his life: to continue a hopeless struggle or to surrender honorably. Choosing mercy over pointless bloodshed, Lee requested a meeting with Grant. The two generals met inside the home of Wilmer McLean, a civilian whose farm had ironically been near the site of the war's first major battle at Bull Run. Now his parlor would host its end. The meeting was solemn but respectful. Grant, mud-stained from campaigning, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would lay down their arms but be allowed to return home with their horses and personal possessions. Officers could keep their sidearms, and none would be prosecuted for treason. Lee, immaculately dressed in his gray uniform, accepted with quiet dignity. As news spread, Union soldiers began cheering, but Grant silenced them, reminding his men that the Confederates were our countrymen again. The surrender at Appomattox did not end all fighting immediately, but it symbolized the collapse of the Confederacy. Within weeks, other Confederate armies across the South followed suit. The war was effectively over, and the United States was preserved at a staggering cost of over 600,000 lives. When word of Lee's surrender reached Washington, church bells rang, cannons boomed in celebration, and crowds filled the streets. After 4 years of fear, sacrifice, and uncertainty, the Union had prevailed. Soldiers' diaries describe a strange mix of joy and sorrow. relief that the war was ending, but grief for the countless comrades who would never return. Families who had sent sons to the battlefield prayed in gratitude while mourning empty chairs at their tables. For formerly enslaved people, the news brought a surge of jubilation. Freedom, long promised by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and enforced by Union armies, was now a reality. Communities of freedmen gathered in prayer meetings, singing spirituals of liberation. Yet the mood was not purely celebratory. Many Northerners wondered what the future would hold. How would the South be brought back into the Union? What rights would freed people truly enjoy? Would bitterness poison reconciliation? Lincoln, always mindful of the deeper purpose of war, framed the moment not as a triumph of one section over another, but as a chance for national healing. In his speeches after Appomattox, he urged malice toward none, charity for all. The Union had been saved, but its wounds were deep. Victory carried not just joy, but also the immense burden of Reconstruction. Still, in those first days after Appomattox, Americans dared to hope that peace had finally returned. Tragically, the nation's relief was short-lived. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington with his wife, Mary. There, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, an actor embittered by the South's defeat, slipped into the presidential box and fired a pistol shot into Lincoln's head. The president was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he lingered through the night before dying at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, at his bedside, uttered the famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages." Lincoln's death stunned the nation. Bells tolled, cities draped themselves in black mourning cloth, and millions wept openly. For many, it felt as though the victory at Appomattox had been cruelly snatched away. Soldiers wrote in their journals that they felt orphaned, as though the father of the nation had been struck down at the very moment of triumph. Booth, meanwhile, fled but was hunted down and killed within days. His co-conspirators were captured and executed. The assassination altered the course of history. Lincoln had envisioned a lenient, compassionate reconstruction of the South, one aimed at reconciliation and healing. With his death, leadership passed to Vice President Andrew Johnson, whose harshness and lack of Lincoln's vision led to bitter political conflicts. Many historians argue that Lincoln's loss robbed America of its best chance for a smoother reunification. For African Americans, his death also cast uncertainty over the full realization of their freedom. Thus, the Civil War ended not with a simple conclusion, but with triumph tempered by tragedy. The Union was saved, slavery destroyed, but the task of building a just and lasting peace was only beginning. The Civil War left the United States deeply scarred. Entire regions of the South lay in ruins. Railroads twisted into Sherman's neckties. Cities like Atlanta and Columbia burned, and plantations abandoned. The human cost was staggering. More than 600,000 dead, countless more wounded, and families torn apart across both North and South. Fields that once grew cotton and tobacco were now overgrown or deserted, while freed African Americans wandered the countryside searching for loved ones sold away in slavery. In northern cities, victory was celebrated, but grief lingered in every household that had lost a father, son, or brother. Soldiers' diaries record a strange silence after the guns fell quiet, an emptiness in which survivors tried to comprehend both relief and loss. Economically, the South faced devastation. Slavery, the backbone of its agricultural system, was abolished, yet no clear replacement existed. Formerly enslaved men and women sought land, wages, and recognition as free citizens. White Southerners, embittered by defeat, clung to racial hierarchies, refusing to see African Americans as equals. Meanwhile, in Washington, leaders wrestled with urgent questions. How would the Union reintegrate the rebellious states? What rights would freed people enjoy? Could reconciliation be achieved without sacrificing justice? Reconstruction was not simply about repairing buildings and roads. It was about redefining the very meaning of the United States. The end of the war opened a new struggle to build a republic where freedom was not just proclaimed but lived. In March 1865, even before Lee's surrender, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency designed to aid millions of formerly enslaved people in the transition to freedom. Its mission was vast: provide food, shelter, medical care, legal assistance, and education. Across the South, Bureau agents, often Union officers, set up schools, distributed rations, and helped freedmen negotiate labor contracts with white landowners. For many African Americans, the establishment of schools was especially transformative. Former slaves, once denied the right to learn, now flocked to classrooms. Children and adults alike crowded into makeshift buildings, eager to read the Bible, newspapers, or letters from distant relatives. Diaries described the joy of learning to sign one's name for the first time, a simple act that symbolized independence. Yet the Bureau faced enormous challenges. Understaffed and underfunded, its agents were often outnumbered by hostility. White Southerners accused them of stirring unrest, while planters sought to reimpose control through unfair labor contracts. Violence erupted as secret groups, precursors to the Ku Klux Klan, intimidated both freedmen and Bureau officials. Still, for all its limitations, the Freedmen's Bureau represented the federal government's first major attempt to promote racial justice. It embodied the hope that emancipation would lead to full citizenship. In the words of one freedman, freedom meant we can't be sold and separated no more. We can have our wives and children with us. The Bureau sought to make that hope a reality, even as resistance mounted. After Lincoln's assassination, leadership fell to Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union. At first, many expected Johnson to punish the former Confederates harshly. Instead, his approach to Reconstruction was surprisingly lenient. He quickly issued pardons to thousands of ex-Confederates and allowed Southern states to form new governments with minimal federal oversight. These governments, dominated by white elites, passed a series of laws known as the Black Codes. Designed to restrict the freedom of African Americans, the Black Codes forced freedmen into labor contracts, barred them from serving on juries, and severely limited property rights. In essence, they sought to recreate slavery in all but name. Northern observers were outraged. Soldiers who had fought and bled for emancipation wrote angrily that the sacrifices of war were being betrayed. Abolitionists condemned Johnson for siding with former rebels over loyal freedmen. Violence in the South, including riots in Memphis and New Orleans, revealed the deadly consequences of unchecked racism. African Americans, who had greeted Union soldiers as liberators, now faced new chains of oppression. Johnson's leniency threatened to undo the very victories of the war. In Congress, a growing group of radical Republicans began pushing back. They argued that Reconstruction must guarantee civil rights and political power for freed people, not merely restore the old Southern elite. The clash between President Johnson and Congress would soon escalate into one of the fiercest political battles in American history, reshaping the future of the nation. Reconstruction had begun, but its path was uncertain, marked by both the promise of freedom and the peril of betrayal. By 1866, It was clear that President Andrew Johnson's lenient approach to Reconstruction had failed. The Black Codes, widespread violence, and the reemergence of the old Confederate elite horrified Northerners who had fought to end slavery. In the midterm elections, Northern voters handed a sweeping victory to the radical Republicans, a faction in Congress determined to reshape the South and secure justice for freedmen. Leaders like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner argued that Reconstruction must go beyond reunion. It must create a new order based on equality. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, overriding Johnson's vetoes. These laws placed the South under military rule, dividing it into 5 districts commanded by Union generals. Southern states were required to draft new constitutions guaranteeing African American men the right to vote before being readmitted to the Union. At the same time, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, declaring all persons born in the United States citizens with equal rights under the law. To cement this principle, the 14th Amendment was introduced, guaranteeing equal protection and due process. Johnson opposed these measures, but Congress overpowered him. The clash between the president and Congress became so severe that Johnson was impeached by the House in 1868 for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Though the Senate acquitted him by 1 vote, his presidency was crippled. Real power now rested with Congress, and radical Reconstruction was underway. The passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868 marked a revolutionary step in American history. It established the principle that no state could deny any person equal protection of the laws. For the first time, the Constitution explicitly extended civil rights to African Americans, striking at the legal foundation of white supremacy. Southern states resisted ratification, but under military pressure, they had little choice. In 1870, another milestone followed, the 15th Amendment, which declared that voting rights could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment enfranchised hundreds of thousands of black men across the South, transforming the political landscape. For African Americans, these changes opened unprecedented opportunities. Freedmen registered to vote in huge numbers, ran for office, and began serving as legislators, sheriffs, and school board members. For the first time in American history, black voices were represented in government at local, state, and federal levels. Leaders such as Hiram Revels and Blanche Kay. Bruce took seats in the U.S. Senate, while many others entered state legislatures. Schools, churches, and civic organizations flourished in freedmen communities, creating a foundation for social and cultural development. Radical Reconstruction was in many ways a moment of genuine democratic revolution. Yet progress was met with fierce resistance. White supremacists refused to accept a society of racial equality. Secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan spread terror, targeting black voters, teachers, and officials with intimidation, lynching, and arson. The federal government responded with enforcement acts to suppress the violence, but the struggle revealed the deep-rooted hostility that Reconstruction faced. The promise of equality was real, but fragile. While the radical Republicans envisioned a South rebuilt on justice, the reality was far more complex. Many white Southerners accepted the end of slavery, but rejected the idea of racial equality. Through violence, economic pressure, and propaganda, they worked to undermine Reconstruction governments. Planters sought to bind freedmen into sharecropping contracts, which trapped many in cycles of debt and poverty little better than slavery. White political leaders labeled Reconstruction regimes as corrupt carpetbagger governments, accusing Northern officials and their Southern allies of exploiting the region. At the same time, Northern support for Reconstruction began to waver. Economic troubles like the Panic of 1873 shifted attention away from Southern issues. Many Northerners, weary of military occupation and resistant to true racial equality, grew indifferent. Though the 14th and 15th Amendments remained enshrined in law, their enforcement relied on political will that was already fading. Radical Reconstruction represented both the boldest attempt to create a multiracial democracy in the 19th century and the beginning of its undoing. For freedmen, the era was bittersweet. They had won freedom, citizenship, and political voice, but lived under constant threat. Still, they built schools, churches, and families, laying a foundation for future struggles. Reconstruction was a turning point in American history, a moment when the nation could have embraced equality fully, but also a moment when that vision faced fierce resistance. The seeds of both progress and backlash were sown in these years, shaping the long struggle for civil rights that would continue well beyond the 19th century. By the early 1870s, the momentum of radical Reconstruction had begun to slow. Though African Americans were voting, holding office, and building new institutions, the resistance from white Southerners was unrelenting. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts used terror to suppress black political participation. Federal troops sometimes intervened, but their presence was limited. Enforcement acts briefly curbed the violence, yet the sheer determination of white supremacists to regain control of Southern society proved overwhelming. At the same time, the North grew weary of Reconstruction. Many white Northerners who had once championed equality turned their attention to industrial growth, westward expansion, and economic opportunity. The Panic of 1873, a severe financial crisis, shifted national priorities from civil rights to survival. Newspapers increasingly portrayed the South's struggles as local problems rather than national responsibilities. Corruption scandals in both Northern and Southern governments further eroded public trust, making it easy for opponents to dismiss Reconstruction as a failure. This decline in Northern resolve was politically significant. Without strong federal enforcement, Southern states began reclaiming power through so-called Redeemer governments, coalitions of conservative Democrats determined to restore white dominance. By the mid-1870s, state after state fell back under their control, often through violence and intimidation. Reconstruction had promised a revolution in American democracy, but its future was slipping away. The presidential election of 1876 brought the conflict to a climax. Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes-faced Democrat Samuel J. Tilden in one of the most disputed elections in U.S. history. Tilden won the popular vote and appeared to have a majority in the Electoral College, but contested results in several Southern states left the outcome uncertain. The crisis threatened to plunge the nation into chaos. To resolve the dispute, leaders from both parties struck the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for granting Hayes the presidency, Republicans agreed to withdraw the last federal troops from the South. This effectively ended Reconstruction. Without military protection, African Americans were left vulnerable to white supremacist violence and political exclusion. Southern Democrats swiftly reasserted control, rolling back the progress of the previous decade. The compromise revealed the fragility of racial justice in America. The same union that had fought a bloody war to abolish slavery now chose political peace over protecting the rights of freedmen. For African Americans, the withdrawal of federal troops meant the collapse of their newly won freedoms. Reconstruction ended not with a decisive conclusion, but with a quiet political bargain that sacrificed justice for stability. In the decades that followed, the South constructed a new system of racial oppression known as Jim Crow. Beginning in the 1880s and 1890s, Southern legislatures passed laws enforcing segregation in schools, transportation, housing, and public spaces. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses stripped black citizens of their voting rights, nullifying the 15th Amendment in practice. Violence continued as lynching became a widespread tool of terror. Communities of freedmen, once politically active, were silenced and pushed to the margins. At the same time, white Southerners promoted the lost cause myth, a romanticized narrative that depicted the Confederacy as a noble struggle for states' rights rather than a defense of slavery. Former generals like Jubal Early and organizations such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy spread this version of history, erecting monuments and shaping textbooks to glorify Confederate leaders. The Lost Cause myth sought not only to heal Southern pride, but also to justify ongoing white supremacy. For African Americans, however, the struggle continued. Despite disenfranchisement and violence, black communities built schools, churches, and businesses. Leaders like Frederick Douglass spoke out against betrayal, reminding the nation that the promises of the 14th and 15th Amendments had not vanished. They remained a standard to fight for. The collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow revealed that while the Civil War had ended slavery, the battle for equality was far from over. The sacrifices of hundreds of thousands had preserved the Union, but the dream of freedom and justice for all would take generations more to achieve. When the guns fell silent in 1865, nearly 3 million men had served in Union and Confederate armies. Those who returned home carried scars, some visible, many invisible. Diaries and letters tell of men missing limbs, eyes, or hands, struggling to adapt to a world that had little sympathy for disability. Amputations, often performed without modern antiseptics, left crude wounds and lifelong pain. Prosthetic limbs were expensive and often uncomfortable, meaning thousands lived with permanent reminders of war. The emotional toll was equally profound. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress, but 19th century America lacked such language. Veterans spoke of sleepless nights, sudden fits of rage, and haunting memories of battlefields littered with corpses. Many turned to alcohol for comfort. Families welcomed them with relief, but often found their loved ones changed in ways difficult to understand. In the South, defeated soldiers returned not only with trauma, but also to devastated communities and ruined farms. In the North, soldiers were hailed as saviors of the Union, yet many struggled to find work in a rapidly industrializing economy. Despite hardships, bonds of comradeship remained strong. Veterans associations, such as the Grand Army of the Republic in the North, provided mutual support, pensions lobbying, and a shared sense of pride. Confederate veterans, too, formed groups to honor their service and remember their lost cause. Across both regions, soldiers created networks of memory, holding reunions where stories were told, tears shed, and fallen comrades remembered. The war had ended, but for veterans, its impact never truly faded. Beyond the soldiers themselves, millions of families bore the consequences of war. An estimated 200,000 women were widowed, and hundreds of thousands of children grew up without fathers. For many families, the loss meant not only grief but also economic ruin. Widows petitioned governments for pensions, but these were often small and difficult to obtain. Some women turned to sewing, teaching, or running boarding houses to survive. In the South, where the economy was already shattered, widows and orphans faced extreme poverty. Plantations were broken up, enslaved labor gone, and Confederate money worthless. Letters from Southern widows describe selling heirlooms just to buy bread. For African American families, the war brought both joy and sorrow. Freedom reunited some with loved ones long lost through slavery, but others discovered that husbands, fathers, or sons had perished in Union service. Black widows and orphans, often excluded from pensions or aid, relied heavily on the newly established Freedmen's Bureau and black churches for support. The war's human cost cut across every race, region, and class, leaving no family untouched. Communities created rituals to cope with the loss. Memorial services, church gatherings, and later Decoration Day, which evolved into Memorial Day, honored the fallen. Cemeteries filled with rows of white headstones became sacred spaces. Women's associations often took the lead, tending graves and ensuring that sacrifice was not forgotten. In both North and South, grief became part of daily life, shaping culture for generations. The Civil War was not just fought on battlefields. It lived on in homes marked by absence. As decades passed, Americans struggled with how to remember the war. In the North, it was celebrated as a triumph of freedom and union, the moment when the nation had been preserved and slavery destroyed. In the South, memory often took the form of the lost cause narrative, which romanticized Confederate soldiers as noble defenders of home and minimized the central role of slavery. This selective memory was reinforced by monuments, textbooks, and veterans organizations. Statues of generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson dotted Southern landscapes, while Union monuments honored victory and sacrifice. Public memory served political ends. By the late 19th century, reconciliation between North and South often came at the expense of African Americans. White veterans from both sides shook hands at reunions, celebrating shared valor while ignoring the unfinished struggle for racial justice. The heroism of black soldiers was frequently omitted from official histories, and Reconstruction's legacy was overshadowed by myths of white unity. Yet memory was also contested. African American communities kept alive the story of emancipation, the role of black troops, and the promise of equality. Through churches, schools, and cultural traditions, they preserved a counter-narrative that challenged the lost cause. The war's memory thus became a battlefield of its own, one shaping national identity. Was the Civil War about states' rights or about slavery? About military valor or moral justice? These debates, rooted in monuments and memory, echo into the present. The Civil War cost over 600,000 lives, but its true legacy was not only death. It was the struggle to define what those deaths meant for America. When the Civil War began in 1861, African Americans were largely excluded from military service in the Union Army. Many white Northerners doubted their ability to fight, while others feared arming former slaves. But the tide shifted after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which explicitly authorized the enlistment of black soldiers. The creation of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, marked a turning point. Nearly 180,000 African American men eventually served in the Union Army, and another 20,000 in the Navy, making up about 10% of the Union's forces. The decision to enlist black soldiers was not merely symbolic. It had practical impact. Formerly enslaved men knew the terrain of the South, brought fierce motivation to fight for freedom, and provided manpower the Union desperately needed. Units like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, made famous by their heroic assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, proved beyond doubt that African American soldiers could fight with extraordinary courage. Diaries and reports from white officers reveal both admiration for their bravery and lingering prejudice. Black soldiers often faced unequal pay, harsher punishments, and dangerous assignments such as manual labor or frontline assaults. Yet their determination never wavered. For many, the uniform was not just clothing but a declaration. They were citizens of the United States, ready to die for liberty. Life for African American soldiers was marked by both triumph and struggle. At first, they were paid less than white soldiers, $10 per month compared to $13. This sparked protests and even refusals of pay, as black regiments demanded equal treatment. In 1864, Congress finally granted them the same wages as their white comrades, a symbolic recognition of their worth. On the battlefield, however, respect was harder to earn. Confederates often treated captured black soldiers brutally, sometimes executing them rather than taking them prisoner, as at the infamous Fort Pillow Massacre in 1864. Such atrocities hardened the resolve of African American troops, who fought with the knowledge that capture meant death. Despite hardships, their contributions were undeniable. By the end of the war, black regiments had fought in hundreds of engagements, from Petersburg to Nashville. They guarded railroads, stormed fortifications, and held lines under fire. Their courage impressed even skeptics, and many white soldiers came to respect them as brothers in arms. President Lincoln himself acknowledged their importance, stating that without the help of black troops, the Union could not have one. Yet after the war, recognition was limited. Many African American veterans returned home to communities still hostile to their presence. They received fewer pensions and honors, and their role in the war was often downplayed in public memory. Still, within black communities, their service became a source of pride, inspiring future generations to claim full citizenship rights. The end of the Civil War brought emancipation, but not the end of struggle. African Americans across the South sought to build new lives from the ashes of slavery. Families long separated by sale or war attempted to reunite. Freedmen and women placed newspaper ads searching for loved ones, and churches became centers for both spiritual and social support. Education was a top priority. With the help of the Freedmen's Bureau and missionary societies, thousands of schools were established. Formerly enslaved adults crowded into classrooms alongside children, determined to master the power of literacy. Economic independence, however, proved more elusive. Few freed people received land, despite hopes of 40 acres and a mule. Instead, many were forced into sharecropping, which often trapped them in cycles of debt and dependence on white landowners. Politically, African Americans briefly gained unprecedented power during radical Reconstruction, voting in large numbers and sending representatives to Congress. But violent backlash soon curtailed these gains, as white supremacist groups used terror to suppress black political activity. Despite these setbacks, African American communities demonstrated resilience. They built networks of mutual aid, founded colleges like Howard and Fisk, and developed cultural institutions that preserved identity and strength. Veterans of the USCT, though often marginalized, remained symbols of pride within their neighborhoods. Their uniforms, medals, and stories passed down through families testified that African Americans had fought and bled for the Union and for freedom. The Civil War had given them a stake in the nation's future, and though Reconstruction faltered, the memory of their service ensured that the struggle for equality would not be forgotten. The Civil War transformed the role of women in American society. When the conflict erupted, few expected that women would play a direct part in the struggle, but the scale of suffering soon demanded their involvement. Thousands stepped forward as nurses, caring for wounded soldiers in makeshift hospitals, field tents, and converted churches. Before the war, nursing had not been considered a respectable occupation for women. But the crisis changed that perception. Figures like Clara Barton, later founder of the American Red Cross, gained fame for tending to soldiers directly on the battlefield, earning the title Angel of the Battlefield. Dorothea Dix, already known for her work in mental health reform, organized the Union Army's Nursing Bureau, recruiting women across the North to serve in hospitals. Conditions were harsh. Diaries from nurses described the overwhelming stench of blood and infection, the constant cries of suffering men, and the exhaustion of working day and night with little rest. Supplies were often scarce, forcing them to improvise with whatever materials they could find. Yet their dedication saved countless lives. Beyond treating wounds, women wrote letters for dying soldiers, comforted the grieving, and served as surrogate family for men far from home. Southern women, too, worked tirelessly, tending to Confederate soldiers despite shortages of medicine and equipment. Nursing during the Civil War not only relieved suffering, but also expanded women's place in public life, proving they could serve with courage and professionalism in roles once reserved for men. Not all women limited their contributions to nursing or the home front. Some took on daring and unconventional roles, serving as spies, scouts, and even disguised soldiers. Women like Harriet Tubman, already famous for leading enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad, became invaluable to the Union cause. Tubman organized spy networks and even guided Union troops during raids in South Carolina, making her one of the few women to lead armed expeditions in the war. Others, such as Rose O'Neal Greenough, a Confederate spy in Washington, passed critical information to the South, influencing battles like First Bull Run. A number of women disguised themselves as men to enlist in the armies. Historians estimate that hundreds may have fought in combat, hiding their identities from comrades and commanders alike. Their stories, revealed later through letters and records, testify to extraordinary determination. Meanwhile, activists such as Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton linked the fight against slavery with the broader struggle for women's rights. For them, the war was not only about Union and Confederacy, but also about redefining freedom and equality on a wider scale. These varied roles demonstrated women's versatility and bravery. Whether gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, smuggling supplies through blockades, or speaking out for emancipation, they expanded the boundaries of what women could do in wartime. Though often unrecognized in official records, their contributions were vital to both sides' war efforts. For most women, the Civil War was endured on the home front, where the absence of husbands, fathers, and sons forced them into new responsibilities. In the North, women managed farms, businesses, and factories, keeping the economy running while men fought at the front. Many joined aid societies, sewing uniforms, knitting socks, and raising funds for soldiers' families. Newspapers of the era are filled with accounts of women organizing fairs and drives that supplied armies with blankets, bandages, and food. In the South, the challenges were even greater. Blockades and destruction left many families destitute. Letters describe women struggling to grow crops, barter for necessities, and protect their homes from foraging armies. Some faced starvation, leading to bread riots in cities like Richmond, where women demanded relief from the Confederate government. Enslaved women, seizing the chaos of war, fled plantations to seek freedom behind Union lines, reshaping their lives and families in the process. The war blurred the boundaries of traditional gender roles. Women proved capable of managing estates, running farms, and handling finances, tasks once reserved for men. Their resilience in the face of hardship left a lasting legacy, helping to spark post-war movements for women's rights. Though often overshadowed by generals and battles, the contributions of women were indispensable. They nursed the wounded, carried secret messages, tilled fields, and held families together, ensuring that the nation survived its darkest hour. One of the most decisive advantages the Union held during the Civil War was its vast industrial base. By 1860, the North produced the overwhelming majority of the nation's manufactured goods, over 90% of firearms, clothing, iron, and machinery. As the war progressed, these factories became the arsenal of the Union. Northern mills churned out uniforms, blankets, and shoes. Ironworks supplied rifles, artillery, and railroad tracks. Shipyards constructed vessels to enforce the blockade of southern ports. Unlike the agrarian South, the North could sustain a long war because it possessed the infrastructure to mass-produce everything an army required. Railroads further amplified this advantage. The North had over 20,000 miles of track compared to the South's 9,000, much of which was fragmented and poorly connected. Union armies used railways to move troops swiftly and deliver supplies across great distances. Telegraph lines, strung along the tracks, allowed commanders and President Lincoln himself to communicate in near real time. This network created a modern system of warfare logistics, enabling the Union to recover from losses and continue pressing forward. Financially, the North introduced innovations to fund the war. The federal government issued greenbacks, a paper currency not backed by gold, which stabilized the economy and created a unified national currency. War bonds sold to citizens financed military campaigns, linking patriotic duty with financial investment. Taxes on income and goods were introduced for the first time, laying the foundation for modern federal revenue systems. Though inflation and shortages existed, the Northern economy overall expanded during the war, fueling industrial growth that would transform the nation long after Appomattox. In contrast, the Confederacy faced enormous economic challenges from the start. Its economy was heavily dependent on cotton exports, yet the Union's naval blockade strangled this trade, preventing access to foreign markets. Southern leaders had believed King Cotton would compel Britain and France to intervene, but European nations turned instead to cotton from Egypt and India. As revenues dried up, the Confederacy resorted to printing vast amounts of paper money, causing runaway inflation. Prices soared so high that a pound of coffee could cost hundreds of Confederate dollars. Diaries from Southern civilians describe lines for bread, shortages of salt and meat, and families forced to substitute chicory for coffee and cloth made from rags for clothing. Transportation was another crippling weakness. The South's limited railroads quickly deteriorated under the strain of war. Without spare parts or iron to repair them, lines broke down, isolating regions from one another. Armies often marched hungry because food, though available in some areas, could not be moved to where it was needed. The Confederate government tried to impose centralized control over resources, but states' rights ideology made coordination difficult. Governors resisted Richmond's demands, hoarding supplies for their own troops. Despite ingenuity, such as women weaving homespun cloth or factories hastily producing weapons, the Confederate economy could not compete with the Union's industrial might. By 1864, shortages and inflation fueled bread riots in Richmond and other cities, with women storming government warehouses in desperation. The Confederacy was not only losing on the battlefield, but also collapsing economically. Its inability to supply armies and civilians alike undermined morale and hastened defeat. The Civil War was not only a clash of armies, but also a test of economic endurance. Both sides paid staggering costs. The Union spent an estimated $3.2 billion, while the Confederacy spent around $1 billion, sums unprecedented in American history at the time. Beyond money, the war left infrastructure in ruins. Southern cities like Atlanta, Columbia, and Richmond lay in ashes. Farms were devastated, livestock slaughtered, and railroads torn apart. For decades after, the South struggled to recover, its economy shifting from slave-based plantation agriculture to sharecropping and tenant farming that kept millions in poverty. The human toll was even greater. Over 600,000 soldiers died, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. Families lost breadwinners, leaving widows and orphans in dire straits. Pensions, while offered in the North, were meager in the South, where Confederate veterans often relied on charity. Inflation, shortages, and destruction created generational hardship, particularly for freed African Americans who entered freedom with little material support. Yet the war also accelerated modernization. The Union's reliance on factories and railroads pushed the United States toward becoming an industrial power. Banking reforms, national currency, and federal taxation established systems that would define post-war America. In this sense, the Civil War reshaped not only the map of freedom, but also the nation's economic foundation. The cost was immense, but it laid the groundwork for the United States to emerge as a modern, industrialized nation in the decades ahead. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which railroads and telegraphs played a decisive role. For the Union, with its dense rail network and industrial capacity, these technologies became vital arteries of war. Troops could be transported hundreds of miles in days rather than weeks, while massive amounts of food, ammunition, and medical supplies moved along steel tracks. Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant, and William T. Sherman relied heavily on railroads to sustain campaigns deep in the South. The Confederacy, with fewer and more poorly connected lines, often found itself unable to reinforce armies or feed civilians efficiently. Broken rails and worn-out locomotives became symbols of its crumbling infrastructure. The telegraph revolutionized military communication. President Abraham Lincoln spent long hours in the War Department's telegraph office, receiving real-time updates from the front. For the first time in history, a head of state could communicate directly with generals on the battlefield, influencing strategies almost instantly. Commanders used telegraph lines to coordinate troop movements across vast distances, though messages were often intercepted or disrupted by enemy raids. Still, the combination of railroads and telegraphs gave the Union a critical edge, turning war into a matter not only of courage, but also of efficient logistics. The Civil War thus foreshadowed the modern age of industrial and technological warfare. The Civil War introduced weapons and technologies that transformed the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. Traditional smoothbore muskets gave way to rifled muskets with many balls, which increased accuracy and range dramatically. Soldiers could now kill from hundreds of yards away, making old-fashioned tactics of mass charges devastatingly obsolete. At battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, entire regiments were cut down in minutes. Artillery, too, advanced with rifled cannons capable of shattering fortifications and wreaking havoc on formations. The lethality of these weapons produced unprecedented casualties, forcing generals to rethink strategies while often clinging to outdated methods. On the seas, innovation was equally dramatic. The clash of the ironclads Monitor and Merrimack, Virginia, in 1862 heralded a new era of naval warfare. Wooden warships, dominant for centuries, were suddenly obsolete. Iron-plated vessels could withstand cannon fire that would have destroyed traditional ships. The Union Navy's adoption of ironclads and blockade runners gave it dominance on rivers and coasts, tightening the noose around the Confederacy. Submarines, such as the Confederate H.L. Hunley, made their debut, though often with disastrous consequences for their crews. Balloon reconnaissance also provided early aerial intelligence, allowing generals to survey enemy positions from the sky. The Civil War became a laboratory of innovation, its horrors shaped by technology racing ahead of tactics. The Civil War was also a turning point in medicine and communication of suffering. Battlefield injuries, made deadlier by rifled weapons, overwhelmed medical systems. Amputation became the most common surgery, performed quickly to save lives, but often without proper anesthesia or antiseptics. Infection was rampant, and disease killed more men than bullets. Yet out of necessity, medical practices improved. The widespread use of anesthesia, the organization of ambulance corps, and the creation of large field hospitals laid foundations for modern military medicine. Nurses like Clara Barton and organizations like the U.S. Sanitary Commission helped professionalize care and introduce practices that would endure beyond the war. Meanwhile, photography brought the brutal reality of war into the homes of ordinary Americans. Photographers like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner captured stark images of battlefields strewn with corpses, the ruins of cities, and portraits of young soldiers before they marched off to die. These photographs shocked the public, stripping away romantic notions of glory. Newspapers and galleries displayed the images, forcing citizens to confront the true cost of the conflict. The Civil War thus became one of the first modern wars to be documented in near real time, bridging the battlefield and the home front in unprecedented ways. Technology, medicine, and communication together transformed the Civil War from a traditional struggle into a harbinger of modern warfare. It was not only a contest of armies, but also of innovation, where industry, science, and invention shaped both victory and tragedy. At the outset of the Civil War, Confederate leaders believed their control of cotton would guarantee international support. The South supplied nearly 3/4 of the world's cotton, feeding Britain's massive textile industry and supplying French mills as well. Confederate diplomats boasted that King Cotton would force Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and perhaps intervene militarily. Yet the gamble proved short-sighted. By 1862, Britain had built up reserves of cotton and found alternative sources in Egypt and India. While the British working class suffered from unemployment and hardship, known as the Lancashire Cotton Famine, public opinion in Britain strongly opposed slavery. Workers' groups and abolitionists declared solidarity with the Union cause, even at personal cost. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, entertained the idea of recognition, but hesitated without Britain's support. Both nations watched closely, waiting for Confederate victories that might justify involvement, but defeats at Antietam and Gettysburg discouraged them. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 transformed the conflict into a moral crusade against slavery, making it politically impossible for European powers to support the South openly. Though Britain and France remained officially neutral, they leaned toward the Union, selling weapons and supplies to Northern buyers while quietly blocking Confederate diplomatic efforts. In the end, King Cotton diplomacy failed, revealing that slavery was a liability in world opinion, not an asset. The Civil War also reshaped global trade and migration. As Southern cotton exports collapsed, global markets adjusted. Egypt's cotton industry boomed temporarily, enriching landowners along the Nile, while India expanded its cotton production dramatically. These shifts altered economic patterns worldwide, some lasting long after the war ended. American wheat exports to Europe also increased, as northern farmers filled gaps caused by poor harvests abroad. Thus, while the South's economy withered, the Union strengthened its global trade links. Immigration continued during the war as tens of thousands of Irish and German immigrants arrived in the North. Many joined the Union Army, swelling its ranks and contributing to the manpower advantage. Some immigrants faced hostility, especially during events like the New York City draft riots of 1863, where Irish working-class men resisted conscription, fearing competition from freed slaves. Yet over time, immigrant participation helped cement the image of the Union Army as a diverse force. The Civil War, far from being a purely American affair, was connected to global labor, trade, and migration flows that bound nations together in unexpected ways. International observers studied the Civil War closely, drawing lessons about modern warfare, industry, and politics. European generals noted the devastating effectiveness of rifled muskets, trenches, and railroads, anticipating future conflicts like World War I. The naval clash of ironclads, particularly the Monitor and Merrimack, inspired navies worldwide to scrap wooden fleets and adopt armored ships. Military academies across Europe analyzed Union and Confederate campaigns as case studies in leadership, logistics, and the limits of traditional tactics in the face of new technology. Politically, the Union's victory carried global significance. It demonstrated that a republic could endure even the greatest internal crisis, refuting European skeptics who believed democracies were fragile and destined to collapse. For enslaved people worldwide, the abolition of slavery in America inspired hope and activism. Cuba and Brazil, which still practiced slavery, faced increased pressure to abolish it in the following decades. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the conflict more united and powerful than before. Its industrial economy surged, its political system survived, and its moral authority as a champion of liberty, though imperfect, resonated abroad. The Civil War thus shaped not only American destiny, but also global history. It weakened the international slave system, altered trade routes, advanced military science, and signaled the rise of the United States as a modern power. While the conflict was fought on American soil, its consequences reached far beyond the nation's borders. Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War left an enduring mark on American history. When he entered office in 1861, the Union was fracturing, and his own experience seemed limited compared to seasoned politicians and generals. Yet his strength lay not in military expertise, but in moral clarity, political wisdom, and an unshakable belief in the Union. Lincoln understood that the Civil War was not merely a struggle over territory. It was a test of whether democracy itself could survive internal division. His steady resolve during defeats, such as Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, reassured a weary North. He endured constant criticism from newspapers, rivals, and even his own cabinet, yet he rarely wavered in purpose. Lincoln's ability to communicate profound ideas in simple language helped rally the nation. From the Gettysburg Address, where he framed the war as a test of liberty and equality, to his second inaugural address, where he called for malice toward none, with charity for all, Lincoln redefined the meaning of the conflict. He linked the Union's survival to the broader cause of human freedom, ensuring that victory would not just preserve the United States, but also expand its ideals. His skillful handling of politics, keeping border states loyal, balancing factions within his own party, and embracing emancipation at the right moment, demonstrated strategic patience and vision. By the time of his death in 1865, Lincoln had guided the nation through its darkest trial, leaving behind a vision of a Union reborn in liberty. Lincoln is often remembered as the great emancipator, yet his path to emancipation was complex. At the start of the war, his primary goal was preserving the Union, not abolishing slavery outright. He feared that moving too quickly might drive border states like Kentucky and Maryland into the Confederacy. But as the war dragged on, Lincoln recognized that slavery was both the cause of the conflict and a strategic weakness of the South. His issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was a masterstroke. It struck at the Confederacy's labor system, prevented foreign recognition of the South, and gave the Union a moral high ground. However, the proclamation alone did not end slavery everywhere. It freed only those enslaved in Confederate-held areas, leaving bondage untouched in border states and parts of the South under Union control. True abolition came with the 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in January 1865 and ratified later that year. Lincoln pushed tirelessly for this amendment, even persuading reluctant Democrats to vote for it. In this sense, his role was not only as a wartime leader, but also as a political craftsman who ensured freedom was enshrined permanently in law. Historians debate whether Lincoln was primarily a pragmatic politician or a moral visionary. The truth lies in both. He evolved with the war, responding to events and pressures, but his personal revulsion towards slavery guided his decisions. He combined pragmatism with principle, shaping emancipation into both a strategic necessity and a moral achievement. His legacy in this regard remains monumental. He not only preserved the Union, but also transformed it into a nation fundamentally opposed to slavery. The tragedy of Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 deprived the nation of his leadership during Reconstruction, but his vision endured. In his speeches and writings, he consistently emphasized reconciliation, unity, and justice. Unlike some radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South harshly, Lincoln sought a middle path, firm in securing emancipation, but merciful in reintegrating the Southern states. His guiding principle was that the Union must be restored with malice toward none. Whether such a course could have succeeded remains an open question, but his death left the task to successors less capable of balancing justice and mercy. Culturally, Lincoln became a symbol larger than life. To many Americans, he embodied honesty, humility, and sacrifice. His image as the rail splitter who rose from poverty to the presidency resonated deeply in a nation that valued self-made success. His assassination turned him into a martyr, ensuring that his legacy would be revered not only as a leader, but as a moral figure. Around the world, Lincoln came to symbolize democracy's resilience. European intellectuals praised him as proof that republics could produce leaders of integrity and vision. In the decades after the Civil War, African Americans in particular carried Lincoln's memory as a beacon of hope. Though Reconstruction faltered and Jim Crow laws spread, the words of the Emancipation Proclamation and the promise of equality remained part of the nation's conscience. Later civil rights leaders would invoke Lincoln's legacy, tying their struggle to his vision of a new birth of freedom. Thus, Lincoln's influence extended far beyond his presidency. He was not only the leader who saved the Union, but also the architect of an America forever defined by liberty, equality, and democracy. The Civil War quickly became a subject of literary reflection, shaping how Americans remember the conflict. Soldiers' diaries and letters, many later published, offered raw, first-hand accounts of the horrors and daily life of war. These writings preserve the human side of the conflict, capturing grief, camaraderie, and hope. In the North, poets like Walt Whitman turned the war into art. Whitman's collection Drum Taps blended personal grief, his brother had been wounded, with a broader vision of national sacrifice. His poems conveyed both the tragedy and the transformative power of war, elevating the suffering of common soldiers into a symbol of democratic endurance. Southern writers also recorded their experiences. Diaries of women like Mary Chestnut offered vivid depictions of the collapse of Southern society, detailing shortages, rumors, and the emotional strain of defeat. Confederate veterans later produced memoirs that contributed to the lost cause narrative, emphasizing valor while downplaying slavery. This literary output reflected competing memories, one of liberation and unity, the other of nostalgia and defiance. The war also influenced popular fiction. Authors like Louisa May Alcott, who served briefly as a nurse, wrote stories blending patriotism with domestic themes, while post-war novels romanticized or critiqued the conflict. These literary works not only documented events, but also shaped cultural identity, ensuring that the Civil War lived on in the nation's imagination as both trauma and inspiration. Music played a crucial role during and after the Civil War. Songs such as Battle Hymn of the Republic, Dixie, and When Johnny Comes Marching Home became anthems that captured the spirit of their respective sides. Soldiers sang to relieve boredom, to steel themselves before battle, and to mourn after defeat. After the war, these songs remained embedded in American culture, sung at reunions and patriotic events. African American spirituals, often sung by freedmen, became powerful symbols of both suffering and hope, influencing later musical traditions like gospel and blues. Visual art also preserved Civil War memory. Painters like Winslow Homer captured battlefield scenes and the lives of soldiers, blending realism with emotional depth. Monument building began almost immediately as communities erected statues and memorials to honor the fallen. In the South, many of these monuments glorified Confederate leaders, embedding the lost cause narrative in stone and bronze. Meanwhile, in the North, grand memorials like the Lincoln Memorial, completed later in 1922, reinforced the Union's triumph and Lincoln's symbolic role as the savior of the Republic. The Civil War even transformed theater and photography. Matthew Brady's stark battlefield photographs brought the conflict's brutality into public view, influencing how people understood war itself. No longer was war imagined only through heroic paintings. Now citizens could see the grim reality of corpses on the field. This democratization of war imagery shaped cultural memory in profound ways, bridging art and journalism. As the decades passed, the Civil War became not only a historical event, but also a cultural touchstone. Annual commemorations, such as Decoration Day, the precursor to Memorial Day, institutionalized mourning, with communities decorating soldiers' graves and holding ceremonies of remembrance. These rituals reinforced shared sacrifice, but also highlighted divisions. Northern and Southern communities often commemorated their own dead separately. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reunions of Union and Confederate veterans symbolized reconciliation, but this reconciliation often came at the expense of African Americans. Public culture emphasized white brotherhood across the former battle lines, while ignoring the promises of emancipation and equality. Literature, monuments, and public ceremonies all contributed to this selective memory. The myth of the lost cause persisted in Southern textbooks and cultural narratives, while Northern accounts celebrated Union preservation, but sometimes minimized the centrality of slavery. Still, African American communities kept alive the memory of emancipation as the war's true legacy. Through church sermons, Emancipation Day celebrations, and oral histories, they preserved the story of liberation. Later generations of civil rights leaders would draw on this memory, linking their struggle to the unfinished work of the Civil War. Thus, the conflict remains central to American identity, not only as a historical event, but as a cultural battlefield over meaning. Whether framed as a story of freedom, unity, or lost glory, the Civil War shaped how Americans saw themselves and their nation's destiny. The most immediate and undeniable legacy of the Civil War was the preservation of the United States as a single nation. In 1861, secession threatened to fracture the Republic permanently, casting doubt on whether democratic governments could endure internal strife. By 1865, the Union had not only survived, but emerged stronger, with its federal authority firmly established. Never again would the idea of secession carry serious weight in American politics. The war resolved once and for all that the United States was a nation, not merely a fragile confederation of states loosely bound together. Equally transformative was the abolition of slavery. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865, nearly 4 million African Americans gained freedom. This was not only a military or political outcome, but a profound moral shift in the nation's identity. The ideals of liberty and equality, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, but long denied to millions, were brought closer to reality. While emancipation did not end racial injustice, it marked a turning point in world history. The United States joined a global movement against slavery, inspiring struggles for freedom in other nations. In this sense, the Civil War was both a national and international revolution, reshaping America's destiny and influencing global debates on human rights. Yet the Civil War's legacy was also marked by contradiction. Though slavery was abolished, the promise of true equality remained unfulfilled. Reconstruction initially offered hope. African Americans voted, held office, built schools, and exercised rights denied for centuries. But violent backlash, white supremacist terror, and Northern indifference undermined these gains. By the late 19th century, the rise of Jim Crow laws institutionalized segregation and disenfranchisement, betraying many of the war's achievements. The dream of a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln envisioned at Gettysburg, remained only partially realized. This tension between promise and betrayal became a defining feature of American history. The struggles of Reconstruction foreshadowed the civil rights movement of the 20th century, when leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. invoked Lincoln's words and the sacrifices of Civil War soldiers to demand justice. The Civil War left a legacy of unfinished work, challenging each generation to confront the nation's deepest contradictions. Its lessons remind us that liberty requires vigilance, and progress is never guaranteed. Freedom, once won, must continually be defended against apathy, prejudice, and resistance. The Civil War remains central to American memory, not only as a military conflict, but as a moral and cultural crossroads. Its battles, leaders, and songs still echo in public culture, from monuments and cemeteries to films and literature. Yet memory of the war has always been contested. For decades, the Lost Cause myth romanticized the Confederacy and minimized slavery's role, shaping education and public symbols in ways that distorted history. At the same time, African American communities preserved the memory of emancipation and black soldiers' heroism, ensuring that the war's meaning as a fight for freedom was not lost. These competing narratives reveal that the Civil War was not just about armies, but about the nation's identity, who counts as a citizen, and what freedom truly means. The war's lessons continue to resonate. It showed that democracy, though fragile, can survive its greatest tests when guided by vision, sacrifice, and leadership. It demonstrated the dangers of division, but also the power of collective struggle for justice. Perhaps most importantly, it underscored that the ideals of liberty and equality are not static achievements, but ongoing pursuits. The Civil War ended more than 150 years ago, yet its shadow lingers in debates over race, memory, and national purpose. In remembering the Civil War honestly, its triumphs and its tragedies, we confront not only the past, but also the responsibilities of the present. Its enduring legacy is a reminder that the work of freedom is never complete. You've just traveled through the epic story of the American Civil War, its causes, its battles, its heroes, and its sacrifices. We saw how courage clashed with tragedy at Gettysburg, how freedom marched with the Emancipation Proclamation, how the Union was preserved at Appomattox, and how Lincoln's vision gave the nation a new birth of liberty. But we also learned that the war's promises were only partly fulfilled. The fight for equality did not end in 1865. It continued through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, and echoes even today. The moral of this story is clear. Freedom is never free. Unity requires sacrifice, and democracy must be defended in every generation. This was the Civil War, a nation divided, brought to you by Historyteller YT. Thank you for listening. If you found this journey meaningful, join us again for more stories where history speaks, teaches, and inspires. Because the past is not gone. It lives with us, shaping the world we build tomorrow. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep the flame of history alive.